You so much, June, and welcome everybody. It's good to see a lot of kindred spirits here. I've been in front of audiences that weren't nearly as friendly, and it's really nice to know I'm not going to, have to duck behind the screen or anything like that. Thank you for that kind introduction, June. I do appreciate it greatly. So, as June said, I've been with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. That's where I started, and then with two agencies that would be called. Good. And two agencies that would be called fish and wildlife agencies generally, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service at the federal level, and then Illinois Department of Natural Resources at the state level. And I'm going to talk a little bit about my experiences during my 40 years in my career, but I got to start before that because, we've all had formative experiences that kind of set the stage for what we did later on during our careers. And I think to give proper context, I'm going to start with that a little bit. So let me just, let's see here. Okay, so I got to start with a quote from Aldo Leopold for two reasons. One, he is my spiritual mentor, or you could probably come up with a lot of terms for what he has meant to me. I first read this book in college, a Sand County Almanac. A fellow student said, "This is a good book to read." And I read it and it changed me forever. And I've read it, I think, dozens of times since. So I've got to start with a quote from him, but also because uh, what he says here, there are some who can live without wild things and some who cannot. I share that sentiment, and I cannot live without wild things either. And that's been the driving force through my whole career. Now, they say that what you got to do with any audience as a speaker is establish a rapport and credibility. And so I got to show you here that I'm one of you. I'm into natural landscaping. Now, I'm not a landscape architect, clearly. I'm not a landscape designer. I'm none of that thing, none of that kind of thing. I am not into the aesthetics, although I like good flowers, but I'm really into clearing an area, sowing out great seed mixes for 3 or 4 years in a row, see what comes up, burn it, and call it a day. And so that's more in the restoration mode than the native landscaping mode. So this is my driveway, and I'm caught in this perpetual battle with this big blue stem every year. It wants to catapult over and take over my driveway. So every year the quandary is this: do I take a weed whacker and clear it all out, or is it time to just rip my driveway out so that the blue stem has a chance to be really wild and free, right? And I'm leaning toward getting rid of the driveway. In the meantime, I kind of drive over on the left side there onto the grass so I don't crush it too much. Um, and truth be known, that little buffer on the right side there, if you see a little bluegrass trying to stick its noses up, and that used to be a good 3 feet wide, but then I was mowing it and you'd see these prairie plants come up in it. And I can't mow that, you gotta, so you give it a little more room, a little more room, and a little room. Pretty soon your whole yard is native stuff, right? But it just goes to show that if you give nature half a chance, it'll do just fine. And that's what this is all about, is giving nature half a chance here. So here are a few other photos that I took this just a couple of weeks ago. Showy goldenrod. What a glorious plant to sort of close out the fall pantheon of flowers. And as I took that picture on the left, I look closer, and on the right, you see the bumblebee in it. And that's one of the reasons why we do this, right? To help pollinators. And we've got this Silphium terebinthinaceum uh, uh, prairie dock. Whew, struggle with that one. Oh, a wild ones person if you can remember the Latin name better than the common name, right? And there's this quote from Leopold. Let's see if I can remember it now. What 1,000 acres of silphium looked like when they tickled the bellies of the buffalo is a question never to be answered and maybe never to be asked. Now, that was in the 30s when he wrote that. And those were grim times. There wasn't a lot of prairie left, and certainly no big chunks of 1,000 acres. But he would be so pleased to know that today we have 1,000-acre tracts of prairie with buffalo in them. And I'm sure there's silphium tickling their bellies somewhere out there. And so, again, if you give nature half a chance, it'll do just fine. And of course, I have to burn it. Um, I burn it so that in the spring, when the spring ephemerals pop up, the bloodroot, the pollinator, those early pollinators find the bloodroot right away, and then the pantheon of flowers progresses through the year. I've got some oak savanna there in my yard. Those two oaks, I looked, there's a cadre of oaks, sort of a cohort of oaks, that includes those two and a couple more in my yard and a couple across the road. And they show up on the 1930s aerials. And one died and it was cut down and I counted the rings. They would have shown up on the 1830s aerials and maybe even on the 1730 aerials because I counted as well as I could 250 rings on them. So Potawatomi may have camped under these trees. And that's a powerful thought to me, to know that that the length of history represented there, um, in the midst of all the new stuff there as well. By the way, I'm a concert. I forgot to give a shout out to Wild Ones from the Conservation Foundation standpoint, because we're good partners. We and the Wild Ones, and I don't even know what the extent of our partnership is. Probably has to do with the Conservation at Home program. And my yard is registered, and I in fact had a sign, Conservation at Home sign by it. I inadvertently burned it up one year because the blue stem was covering it and I forgot about it. And the next thing I knew, there was this shriveled up. So note to self, get another sign when I'm at the Conservation Foundation offices next. Anyway, you didn't want to just look at flower pictures, or maybe you did. I could have put more in here. But I want to talk about the origins of the North American wildlife conservation movement because I spent my career working for a wildlife agency, and this is how we got started. And I thought this was good context. It started with the slaughter of wildlife. We can't even imagine the abundance of wildlife in sort of the pre-European settlement times and for the first several hundred years of European settlement. It was here in prodigious quantities. It must have been something to see. And so market hunters sprung up because they could make a buck off of shooting thousands of ducks, and they would shoot them with that's called a punt gun in the front of that boat, because the boat is called a punt boat. And a punt boat is a flat bottom boat with a flat deck like that you can mount a big cannon like this on. And they would dump 2 or 3 pounds of shot into that cannon, sneak through the marshes until they saw a raft of who knows how many ducks fire away, and 100 of them would drop. And that's how they'd get numbers like this. I want to be clear, sportsmen were also part of this problem too, because they harvested great numbers of waterfowl as well. Uh, but sportsmen led the effort to establish the principles of wildlife conservation. Um, and none other than President Theodore Roosevelt was among the leadership there. And the conservation of natural resources is the fundamental problem. Unless we solve that problem, it will avail us little to solve all others. And that is as true today as it was in his time. So what came about was what is still called the origin of the North American model of wildlife conservation, beginning in the late 1800s, when really we started to see the decline of all these wildlife species, and then into the early 1900s. And it was in response to major declines, including the extinction of things like the passenger pigeon, but the decline of bison and waterfowl and beaver and you name it, from overharvest from both market hunters and sportsmen. So we developed a few basic principles. Wildlife are a public trust. They're not owned by any individual. They're owned by all of us collectively, and government is the trustee on our behalf. And they manage that for us. And what happened is laws were established that set the rules for the legal take of wildlife, seasons and bag limits and things like that, which obviously persist to this day. Markets were eliminated, so there's no more worry that people were going to, be able to shoot huge numbers and sell them in the marketplace. So that was a key principle. And then state fish and wildlife agencies were created to enforce game laws and manage species valued by sportsmen. I want to emphasize here the part about species valued by sportsmen, because those were the species, the ones that were being hunted or fished, those are the ones that were being basically eliminated, almost driven to extinction. Everything else was kind of doing okay still in the late 1800s, early 1900s. But we needed the biggest threat to wildlife was people and these market hunters and the sportsmen who were taking too many. So that's why we were created, and that was our job. We were funded by license sales. It's kind of an interesting model, funded by license sales, and then later federal funds that were dedicated to fish and wildlife management. So we were supported by these license fees. We hired game wardens and later biologists to manage these things and enforce federal laws and buy land and waters where people could hunt and fish. And it was one of these user pays, user benefits models. It was a very closed system at that time. And this was the primary constituent, this guy with the shotgun and his colleague who held a fishing rod. It was for their benefit, so they could hunt and fish, and the resource would be maintained in a sustainable way. And it worked quite well, actually. It brought a lot of these species back. Waterfowl increased. Turkeys were extirpated from Illinois. Now they're in every county, as are river otters. They were trapped to extirpation in Illinois. Now they're in all 102 counties. As a kid, I don't remember, even though I was out and about in the fields and forests all the time, I don't remember ever seeing a deer. This would have been in the 60s. And they all came back. Bald eagle's in a little bit different category, but it's a good transition to where I want to go with this, because even though they were harvested, meaning shot, to the point where we had to pass the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act in the 1930s, that wasn't the only threat. As you know, in the 60s, when some of these pesticides came into play, that's when they started having contaminant issues that caused thin eggshells and hurt them and many other raptors in the same way. So we started to see in the 50s and 60s the first introduction of other threats beyond just hunting and fishing, other threats to wildlife, which changed the business of fish and wildlife agencies terrifically. And how do I get rid of that top bar?
Spots over by more, where it says more, and hide
Hide.
controls. I think.
I should have asked that question. Cynthia, you are a hero. You saved my presentation. All right. So where we've gotten to now is here. The conservation community faces unprecedented issues of scale, pace, and complexity in sustaining our nation's fish and wildlife resources. And this is not progressing. It's stuck. Let's see if I can, what did I do now?
You got rid of it.
When I got rid of the bar.
3 days ago, and it still worked. You have an arrow bar on your laptop?
Oh, there, wait a minute now.
No. You should still be able to advance. There you go. Something happened.
There you are.
Oh, okay.
Oh.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, look at this thing. So, by the year 2042, we're going to be at 9 billion people. And as the number of people increase with rapid industrialization and development, resource management challenges such as habitat fragmentation, contamination, pollution, invasive species, disease, all of these are going to be compounded by increasing energy development as well. Whether renewable or not, they all impact wildlife. Now, when I was with the, and complicated tremendously by the granddaddy of all threats, which is climate change. When I was with the Fish and Wildlife Service, as these transitions in society were happening and in the environment, we were trying to reinvent ourselves, and we had a publication that was called Reinventing the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or something like that. And that sentence at the bottom was straight from it. conservation challenges of the 21st century represent a force of change more far-reaching and consequential than any previously encountered. So that greatly expanded the role of fish and wildlife agencies and the whole conservation community. But I was a kid in the 60s and I was just having fun. And I was lucky enough to grow up in Belvedere, Illinois, and my wonderful, blessed, glorious Kishwaukee River ran right through it. And so I'd get up before dawn, throw the fishing rod on, grab the earthworms I'd collected overnight, go down to the river and meet my buddy, and we'd fish till noon. We'd go home for lunch. We'd go back to the river in the afternoon and have more fun. And it was just, everyone should grow up by a river, I think. And I read these, magazines like Field and Stream and Outdoor Life. And of course, family, my dad always took us on, summer fishing trips. And it was just terrific. And if you talk to any Fish and Wildlife Agency person of my cohort, of my age group, this is how they got there. And it's not so true anymore because you were having to bring in a lot of more different disciplines into the business now to deal with these all other threats. But this was the pathway by which you got to be, somebody with a Fish and Wildlife Agency. But even then, even in my childhood, as much fun as it was, I was reading stories like about the Cuyahoga River in Ohio. It was catching fire, a river catching fire because of all the pollutants, hydrochemicals, and things like that in there. And in my own Kishwaukee River, it was wonderful until you left town. And on the edge of town was the sewage treatment plant. This was before the Clean Water Act. It was, I think they maybe did some primary treatment, but what came out of the pipe was just scary stuff. And this is what it looked like on the river. And you just didn't go past that point. That was the end of our river for us. So there was big problems with the environment in that era. And then at that point, also marine biologist, nature writer, just amazing person, Rachel Carson, turned environmental activist. Wrote Silent Spring. She's credited with starting the environmental movement. And what astounds me as much as anything about her had nothing to do with anything she did consciously. She was a woman in those days. Still always was. Actually, she stayed a woman. But she and her book Silent Spring, if for any of you who remember this, were met with fierce opposition by chemical companies, big moneyed interests. And they spread a massive disinformation campaign. They attacked her scientific credentials. They called her names, not a liberal leftist whack job like they would today. Back in those days, they called them communists. That was the name that they called her. And that meant a lot back in those days. But her book created a total reversal in national pesticide policy. So the originator of the modern environmental movement. There was a lot of, in the 1960s, for those of you who remember, it was a decade of citizen activism. There was strong anti-war sentiment, strong civil rights sentiments, strong environmental sentiments. And Wisconsin Senator Gaylord Nelson, that's his photo there, he took advantage of that. He channeled the environmental activism into a nationwide teach-in. Remember, we called everything something in, like laugh in, sit in. They were all something ins. So he sponsored a nationwide teach-in that became known as Earth Day. 20 million Americans participated in rallies, cleanups, educational programs. And I would love to know how they organized them before social media, before any of that stuff. 20 million people. Now, the No Kings rally, the big one that just happened, it attracted 7 million across the country. And I read where that's the biggest gathering of people since 1970. And this is what it was being compared to when 20 million people came out in support of the environment. And we'll see if we can get there again at some point. All of this led to the creation of US EPA by none other than Republican President Richard Nixon. Now ponder that, a Republican president creating the EPA. That's all. That's the only political commentary I'm going to make tonight. uh, but and this is what it all led to. That environmental activism led to the most incredible set of environmental laws over a 10-year period that is imaginable. And it's unimaginable that that could happen today with the Congress that's, divided and split and that doesn't do anything anyway. But think of it, the granddaddy of them all was the National Environmental Policy Act. And that said that the federal government will not take any action without considering the environmental effects of that action. That led to environmental impact statements, environmental assessments, and things like that. We have the Clean Air Act, which sets and enforces air quality standards, the Clean Water Act, which commits our nation to restoring the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters, and says we'll do that by not dumping pollutants into them. We have the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, which spells out how hazardous waste will be handled. The Toxic Substances Control Act, which regulates production of new chemicals. I mean, Congress was serious about this stuff. We have CERCLA, the Superfund law with its cleanup provisions and the polluter pays provisions. I jumped over the Endangered Species Act, which says that basically a civilized society does not drive its fellow creatures to extinction. And it commits the nation to recovering listed species. We created an agency, namely US EPA, to oversee most of this. And then within the state of Illinois, we had the passage of the Illinois Natural Areas Preservation Act in 1963, which was pushed through almost single-handedly by George Fell. Now, if any of you have read the wonderful biography by Arthur Pearson, Force of Nature's biography of George Fell, please read it because it really is an eye-opener and inspiring and enlightening what an individual can do. And then we saw he founded the Natural Land Institute, by the way, as well as the Nature Conservancy before that. So no small accomplishments. Anyway, these two statutes, the Natural Areas Preservation Act and the Illinois Endangered Species Protection Act, resulted in a quantum leap in the responsibilities of the Illinois Department of Conservation at that time. It wasn't Natural Resources yet. And it expanded the mission far beyond their traditional hunting and fishing mandates, and it would never be the same. So what comes next? Oh, and so here's what it accomplished. I'm just one example of the Clean Water Act. In 1904, that was on the left, that was the North Branch of the Chicago River. I didn't take that photo, by the way. I know I'm an old guy, but not that old.
You did.
But June did. But imagine what it looked like at that time. And then on the right is the North Branch in 1960. I didn't take that picture either, but I sure do remember what it looked like. It was full of filth, absolute filth. It had a total of 6 species of fish that could be collected from it, and it was just a total mess. And this is what it is today. Urban rivers, along with Friends of the Chicago River and the City of Chicago and other partners, are creating the Wild Mile. They're rewilding the river pieces that go around Goose Island. And they're building floating wetlands, and the river now supports 78 species of fish. This is because of the Clean Water Act. This is what happened. Major, major successes. I wonder if I can just push this now. Let's see what it does. Oh, there we go. Anyway, I was off to college. I went to Northern Illinois University and majored in biology. And that guy there is a professor, retired now, named Paul Sorensen. Now, we all had mentors in college or through life, but in college especially, I had a number of them, but Paul was the first. I was floating around one semester. I needed another biology class. I didn't know what to take, and they weren't offering a whole lot, but they were offering this class called plant taxonomy. I said, oh, okay, I'll take that one. And Sorensen was the professor, and I visited the first week of the class. I visited my first prairie remnant. It was Afton Cemetery in DeKalb County, and I was transfixed as he pointed out plant after plant after plant, none of which I'd ever seen before. And it went from there. That was my beloved Montgomery Hall down there on the bottom of that screen. by the way, this is Paul Sorensen about a year ago, uh, on the eve of his 90th birthday, and I still take him plants and he identifies them for me. Wonderful man. But then I had to go to work, right? You'd graduate, you got to get a job, and so I started working for the Corps of Engineers, and I got into what's been called the Wetlands Regulatory Program. Now, it was important for Illinois because 90% of our wetlands are gone. Former wetlands, 20% of the state. Now it's 2.3%. Important now, did you know this is a state wetlands week? Anybody know that?
Yeah.
I don't know who named it that, but this is state wetlands week right now. And there is a wetlands bill being floated around Illinois now. And so be aware of that. So this is what I did. One of those laws I talked about earlier, my first job was working to implement provisions of that law. Section 404 of the Clean Water Act regulates placement of fill material into waters of the United States. And that definition includes wetlands, but over the years, it's been highly contentious because it really is a land use bill in the end. It tells what people can do with their lands if it has wetlands on it. So jurisdiction has expanded. In the 1980s, it was as expanded as it ever got. And that's when I was working the program. Wet spots in farm fields were jurisdictional at the time. And that was a crazy, crazy time. But then it contracted greatly over the decades through Supreme Court decisions. And it will probably stay in flux because it was not well defined in law, currently in a time of contraction, but it fueled great advances in the science and practice of wetland restoration and creation. And I can't tell you how many classes and symposia and conferences I went to and books I read about wetland restoration and creation because people had to mitigate, if they filled a wetland, they had to mitigate that. And that meant creating or restoring a wetland someplace else. Now, and there was very little science on it. So we were all trying to figure out how do you do that? Had a lot of failures at the front end, part of which was because of an ill-conceived policy that we had at the time that said you got to mitigate on site, meaning if you're filling a wetland for a corporate campus, you got to rebuild that wetland on that site somewhere. Well, that's silly because no place else except that one site on that, that one wetland on that site was suitable. So, but very quickly we went to wetland mitigation banks, and we were just starting to create banking and banking instruments when I left the Corps of Engineers. But banks are great because you find sites in the watershed that used to be wetlands. So all the hydrologic conditions are right to begin with. And a lot of times it's just a matter of removing tiles, maybe putting in a water control structure or two and planting it, and you're off to the races. And so banks have been really the primary way that people mitigate now. But a recent study was done by the people at the University of Illinois, and they in light of this recent Supreme Court Sackett versus U.S. EPA decision just 2 years ago, they looked at that and they showed that 72% of Illinois wetlands are no longer protected by the Clean Water Act. And that is what is fueling a state level wetlands bill. And that's why you'll see evidence of that soon. Then I went to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It was the Chicago field office. We handled 6 counties. A lot of what we did was endangered species work, but we did all these other things as well. And we worked with partners. And that was a major change in the way we did business, working with partners. We didn't try and do it within our own stovepipe. We reached out and used others to help us do our work. We had a program called the Partners for Fish and Wildlife, and we worked with private landowners on that. And so I'm glad, June, you mentioned this, and because I knew you'd be here, and I have to. So this is an example of a project we did with stakeholders, meaning the sites that the landowners that owned the eastern prairie fringed orchids on their property. Generally, it was like county forest preserve districts and entities like that. But we developed this project, and June was part and parcel of it, where we hand pollinated the orchids because the hawk moth, the nocturnal hawk moth, had been decimated by pesticides and other kinds of things, and so there wasn't proper pollination. So there was an interesting technique that I won't go into, but it involved toothpicks and moving pollen from one flower to a flower of another plant, and we greatly increased seed set. 2020, by the way, the year that I know something about what we did through that project. This is a 25-year-old project. And June was the volunteer coordinator for many years. 2020 was the best year for blooming orchids in Illinois, reaching a 29-year high of 2,287 blooming plants. Oh, Suzanne was a big part of this project too. I forgot. Didn't know who's all going to be here. I would have done a shout out for you there, but glad I caught it still. The Chicago Botanic Garden was a big, big partner in this effort. But again, everything we did involved partners. Wetland restoration efforts involved all of these different entities. Each one brought something a little bit different to the mix, whether it was funding or engineering expertise or biological expertise, whatever it was. And we started to use individual volunteers as well. I think this is Prairie Wolf Slough in Lake County. I may be wrong, but I think that's what this is. And they helped us with all the planting. And volunteers, as you probably know, are one of the Chicago region's most unique assets, starting with the Volunteer Stewardship Network of the Nature Conservancy, and now who work side by side with professionals as one conservation community. And this is something I've watched grow through my entire career. And so a lot of the slides I'm showing, I didn't have to really look very far. I just kind of paid attention to current journals that were coming across my desk or in the mail or through email. And I found this one. Think of the contributions that citizen scientists make now. There is a Bees of North America database, which I didn't know about, which came from Bumblebee, which was populated mostly by professionals, but somebody did this study that looked at all the entries and found that volunteers contributed a full quarter of all the sightings of Bumblebee the database. I didn't know Bumblebee Watch existed. Anyone remember Bumblebee Watch? All right, so you didn't know either, or maybe you did. Okay, who'd have thought? Anyway, back in Leopold's day, he talked about what citizens can still contribute to our knowledge of natural history. He could not have imagined what we can do through cell phones and cameras and digital data and the internet. He would be very grateful and thankful and think it was very cool, I know. And now I want to shift into the Chicago region's land base, because this is something else that is public land space that is utterly unique, I think, of urban areas. And we can attribute it to the origins of it to these guys in the lower right, Daniel Burnham at the top, Dwight Perkins, Jens Jensen on the left. And they were these early civic leaders who, in the early 1900s, saw the city of Chicago sprawling out over the fields and the woods and the prairies. And they thought, we need to set aside examples of these before they're all gone. And so they created this tradition of setting aside lands right in the middle. Well, at that time, it was on the fringe of the urban area, but it's started that practice. And this was, they set aside these natural lands that were still in a very natural condition. This was before the science of ecology had a name. Biodiversity wasn't a word. They did it because they realized people needed to be close to nature, and they needed to have it in close proximity for them to thrive. And it was about quality of life for them, even though that term didn't exist either at the time. So these data here are from my good friend David Holman, because I said I needed a current total in August, and he quickly cranked this out. This is the acres of protected lands in northeastern Illinois by category. Obviously, you can see county forest preserves have the greatest total acreage. We're throwing park districts and departments into this. A lot of them have natural lands. On and on. You can see the total 325,000 acres just in the Chicago part of the region, in the 6 or 7 county region. And this is really incredible. What we've been able to do to continue to add to this. You know how we add to it? You all ask for it. Really, in essence, it's these referenda that get put out to the voters, and they say, would you be willing to pay more for more open space? And since 1993, there you go. Voters in the Chicago area have approved 52 out of 56. Just unbelievable. Totally more than 2 billion and protected more than 40,000 acres. That's how we do business here. And of course, we did 4 of them just last fall. I was pleased to be part of it. Actually, that led to me joining the Conservation Foundation board because all of a sudden Brooke McDonald is, well, you know, maybe you ought to come and do this on a more regular basis. So, and one of the incredible developments too, to celebrate and restore and protect this amazing land base was the creation of Chicago Wilderness. Now, the way this started is in the early 1990s, the land managers who worked for these agencies who were responsible for taking care of these lands said, we're being overwhelmed. We can't cope with this. We need new resources to help us do this. And so what we came up with was a grand partnership in the Chicago area. We called it Chicago Wilderness. I could have 3 presentations just on that. But we self-organized the entire conservation community and a good bit of the civic community around this effort. It wasn't just open space we were talking about. We were talking about the diverse living heritage of our natural communities. We developed a biodiversity recovery plan. All of this still continues today. And one of the promises of Chicago Wilderness from the very beginning, because the land managers wanted this, is the promise of more resources. And we were able to deliver on that. If you look toward the bottom, more than 14 million in federal conservation funds were brought to the table. That was through my agency, Fish and Wildlife Service at the time, but also the U.S. Forest Service. And it was leveraged against 80 million over 17 years. So we met the promise of what we wanted to do. Over 500 projects done over the years. Okay, steel yourself. You always wonder, do people want to hear the bad news first and then the good news, or the good news first and then the bad news? And I'm going to mix it up a little bit, but we're going into a bad news part. So I want you to be prepared. So wildlife has continued to decline, and quite bluntly, we're going into the 6th global extinction event. We're on the front end of it right now. It's not irreversible, but if we stay on the trajectory we're on, we won't live to see the ultimate manifestation of it. But make no mistake about it, we're on track for that right now, and for a variety of reasons. I'm just talking about wildlife here, but it goes for all biodiversity. Over 150 U.S. wildlife species have gone extinct. Actually, half or more of these are in Hawaii, but plenty in the continental U.S. here too. Another 500 have not been seen in decades, and they're presumed extinct. And this is a challenge to know when to call something extinct, because as soon as you do, maybe you find one, right? But after enough time passes, you see, okay, that's probably it. Over 1,300 North American animal species are listed as endangered or threatened under the Endangered Species Act. This is the emergency room. The Endangered Species Act is the emergency room. We put them on the list when they're in dire, dire straits. And our freshwater fauna has been impacted the most. 40% North American freshwater fish species are rare or imperiled, and 60% of North American freshwater mussels are imperiled or vulnerable. And then you've heard of the insect apocalypse. And this was kind of, by scientists, this was considered hyperbole when the term first came out, because it was based on a couple of studies in Europe that they were good studies, and they were long term too, and showing that insects were really declining. But scientists are buying into this now because they're seeing it's a global trend and a global pattern. Formerly common species are now at risk. You might remember 5 or 6 years ago, the billion bird loss study that showed that 3 billion birds have vanished from North America over the period of decline. There they are since 1970 to 2010, 2.9 billion birds gone in 50 years. These are individual birds, not species of birds, but individual birds. 2025, 6 years later, it's not improving, but you wouldn't expect it over 5 years. 2025 U.S. State of the Birds Report, alarming declines, 229 species needing urgent conservation action, but it tried to put some positive spin on it. Beyond the moral and ethical imperatives here, it's dollars and cents as well. The number of the amount of money that bird watchers and other birding related activities contribute is significant. And importantly, and there's plenty of evidence for this, conservation efforts can succeed if we put the resources behind it. A few more examples, and this one strikes home with me because I do not see as many great blue herons around anymore as I used to. The red, by the way, if you look at the legend at the bottom, red means more loss, blue means more gain over this period of record. I think this goes back to the 90s at some point, or maybe even before that. 20 to 40% decline in great blue herons in the past decade here, in the heart of their range. And there's no real explanation for it that's scientifically supported. If you look at the eBird trends for obligate grassland birds, which is the guild of birds more threatened than any other guild of birds, at least in North America and maybe globally. But they've experienced significant loss as well. And look at Illinois, losses everywhere. Mike Ward from the Illinois Natural History Survey, my good friend and colleague, the ornithologist, says if it were not for Farm Bill programs, meaning like conservation reserve, there would be virtually no grassland birds in Illinois, perhaps outside of our collar counties here where we've got the habitat. So, and this is, I have personal recollections as a kid. Meadowlarks on almost every farm field, every fence post, you'd hear them calling all the time. You don't see them much anymore. Causes, this is probably pretty familiar. Habitat loss is the biggest one. And the thing about habitat loss, it's so visible. You can see it. You don't have to guess at it. You don't have to study it too much. You can see it. Invasive species are a significant contribution to wildlife decline. Chemical pollution, especially pesticides, a pretty significant cause. Climate change. Now that's the tough one because you don't see it. You have to do deep scientific studies over long periods of time to really document the effects of climate change. And wildlife diseases, which is a natural background thing going on that makes all the other ones just as bad. So I'm going to talk about some of these stresses in a little bit of detail just to show you what I'm talking about. And this would relate to grassland birds. This is not Illinois necessarily. I pulled it off a free internet service. But this is what the 1950s ag landscape would have looked like. And what you see is small fields with fence rows that provided habitat. You see some row crops, probably corn or beans, but you see small grains, probably and you see pasture and hayland, grass hayland. And those were our surrogate prairies for many years, and grassland birds did very well in them. But agricultural economics changed, and consolidation of farms became the rule. And in 2025, it looks more like this. Fence rows are gone. Fields are huge now. They're almost exclusively row crops of corn and beans, which don't provide much wildlife habitat at all. Take the monarch as another another example, rather. Pesticides are a big threat. Neonicotinoids, which they coat ag seeds with neonics, and those become taken up by the whole plant, and any insect that feeds on it suffers neurological problems from it, and that's its modus operandi, basically. But there's habitat loss, so this isn't just one cause, there's habitat loss. I should have said monarchs have declined by like 90% in the past 30 or 40 years or so. Increased use of herbicide-tolerant crops. You can just spray Roundup over the fields where you couldn't do that before because it would have killed the soybeans, right? But now you can, and so it gets rid of the milkweeds that monarchs are dependent on. There's development impacts and habitat loss there, illegal logging in the overwintering grounds in Mexico, and then the background of natural diseases and natural causes as well. And then climate change. And we used to call climate change as the threat amplifier. So whatever threats you already had, you pile climate change on top of that, and it's just one more stress that further causes problems for them. But increasingly, we're seeing climate change as the only logical explanation for declines of some things. Scrub jays, amazing birds, working harder but producing fewer chicks for complicated reasons. I won't go into it. Again, I just had to pull up the current issue of Living Bird magazine to find this one. Another one from All About Birds. And here's the scary one. New links between tropical forest bird declines and climate change. These are in deep, dark rainforests, undisturbed rainforests of Central and South America. Declines among forest birds that can't be explained by habitat loss or pesticides or anything else. Birds should be thriving there, but they're not. And the only logical explanation is climate change itself as a standalone thing. Here's one closer to home. This is in the Colorado Rockies. Insect abundance declined 6.6% annually in these montane regions where there's no habitat loss. Again, there's no obvious other explanation other than climate change as the causal agent. So that's serious. I'm going to move on from that threat now and into invasive species because, again, it's one of the most significant problems. You probably know all this. It's a global problem. The important driver is globalization of trade. We move people and goods all over the planet now, and we bring in hitchhikers as a result. Some of them some of them just stay non-native species and they kind of behave themselves. In fact, I would say most of them do, or they die out because they're not adapted here, but some are super adapted. Those are the ones that become invasive and start to cause these problems. They outcompete natives for food and space. They cause major disruptions to native ecosystems. 42% of all species listed as endangered or threatened include invasive species as one of the contributing factors. So it's a major problem. And it costs big time too, 21 billion bucks a year. I'm going to show you this example, the best single one of invasive species issues that involve the Great Lakes. It has 180 documented alien species in it now that aren't native to the Great Lakes. The vertical axis is number of alien species. Not necessarily invasive, but just alien. Per decade, starting in the 1830s and 1840s, where you started to document some increase all the way up to the 2000s and 2010s, you see those last two bars haven't moved. So we haven't increased at that point. There's a reason for that, because the major source of alien species in the Great Lakes was ballast water that would come over on freighters that were crossing from the Caspian Sea and the Baltic Sea and places like that. They would dump their ballast water in our waters and dump all these species in there. That's changed. Now they got to exchange ballast water out at sea, so that won't happen like it did before. But the Great Lakes, sea lamprey was the one big one we all remember from our childhoods that was in the Great Lakes. That is native to North America, the Atlantic coastal marshes. First seen in Lake Ontario in 1835, but it didn't get to Lake Erie until like almost 100 years later. And why was that? Well, it was because there was a pretty big barrier there called Niagara Falls. And what happened, of course, is we built the Welland Canal that connected Lake Ontario with Lake Erie with a whole series of locks, and lamprey were able to get up that way. And in about 15 years after they first made it into Lake Erie, they were all the way to Lake Superior. and they destroyed the lake trout population. Now, lake trout were the top predator in the Great Lakes, the very pinnacle. You take out a top predator, and that's going to have huge ecological disruptions at every layer below it. We spend 25 million a year, probably more than that now, annually controlling sea lampreys. And the way we do it, you see that guy in the bottom there in that stream, he's pumping a chemical called TFM into the stream, which disrupts larvae, lamprey larvae. That's the pinch point where you can get them when they go up to spawn. And it's been wildly successful, but we'll have to do this till the end of time to keep sea lamprey under control. But they wiped out the lake trout. So what do we do? Well, here's what happened when we wiped out lake trout. Their primary prey, alewives, which is another invasive or an alien species at least, it went nuts because there was no top predator to keep them in control anymore. And I remember as a kid seeing images of alewives being shoveled up by and put into dump trucks from Lake Michigan beaches because there were so many of them following the beaches. So what are you going to do? We need more top predators. We didn't have more lake trout. We weren't producing lake trout in hatcheries back then. But state of Michigan said, hey, we'll just throw Pacific salmon in there. They'll be a good combo. And it led to a new day for sport fishing in the Great Lakes. And they were great predators on alewives too, and other things, coho, salmon, and Chinook. But they were hardly native to the Great Lakes. But that wasn't the end of it by a long shot. Then zebra and quagga mussels moved in, and these are the real problematic things. They came over in ballast tanks that I mentioned earlier. They encrust all hard surfaces. I read some estimate of like 7 trillion quagga mussels on the bottom of the Great Lakes now. And the problem there, they are filter feeders and they feed on plankton. Every single thing living fish and other aquatic organisms, when they're little, they feed on plankton. So it's a food chain and a food web issue. You go down to Lake Michigan now, I don't know if you ever looked lately, it's like gin clear. It wasn't like that 40 years ago because there was a lot of plankton in the water. Now, these things filter out all those plankton and sort of bring it into their own biomass that sits at the bottom of Lake Michigan. And there's not as much plankton for baby lake trout now, or baby perch, or baby bluegills, or baby, you name it. And so it affects all the other species in the Great Lakes food web. Great Lakes are a real issue. And these were invasives that came in from the St. Lawrence Seaway. They're coming up the other direction too in the form of these invasive carp. And I could spend another 2 hours talking about those because I spent a lot of my career working on these, brought in with the best intentions. They were imported into Arkansas fish farms to clean up algae and aquatic plants and things like that. But guess what? They escaped. They got into the Mississippi River system. They moved up the Mississippi, up the Ohio, up the Illinois, up the Missouri River. And they were on the verge of getting into the Great Lakes because the Illinois River ultimately connects with Lake Michigan. And so like, holy smokes, we caught it in time. We saw these things coming up and said, we got to do something. So Congress authorized and appropriated funds to the Corps of Engineers to build this electric barrier in the Sanitarian Ship Canal. This is it. That's the power station right there. You don't see the barrier because there are electrodes that go down underneath the canal and up the other side, and it keeps these fish from moving any further upriver. There's a new one being built because there's a better place for a barrier. It's going to be downriver a bit at the Lockport Lock and Dam. It's under construction now. But we spend that Lockport project is right now it's a $1.3 billion project, all to keep these invasive carp out of the Great Lakes. Huge political issue as well as a biological issue. All right, I'm going to tell a good story. Purple loosestrife. You all remember when we had seas of purple. I remember Fearsome Creek Fen, right? Seas of purple. And what was done there is we found the natural predators in Europe. And after about a 10-year process of isolating those and quarantining them and testing them on our native loosestrife to make sure they wouldn't be causing any problems. They were released, and we did a release at a whole bunch of sites around here, and it has worked amazingly well. And now I see purple loosestrife. I mean, there are exceptions, but I see purple loosestrife kind of acting like just a normal native now. You see it here and there. You don't want it to go away completely because then the beetles won't have anything to feed on, right? You want to keep them around. They're part of our flora now, but not nearly to the extent that they were. All right, I'm going to talk about people now because people are a big part of what fish and wildlife agencies manage. I think we just manage wildlife. No, we have to manage people. And they never taught us any of this in college. This is like learning it on the job. But we're in a world in transition. Urban population as a percent of the total US population went from in 1910 about 45% of the population. Now we're at 80%. And it's staying at about 80%, but that has profound implications. You know, city folk don't necessarily relate to the outdoors like people in rural areas do, and they have different value systems and things like that. But as we all know from living here, cities are sanctuaries. Cities are important for biodiversity conservation. Nowhere is that more prominent than right here in the Chicago area. And I've got to highlight the good old piping plover, you know. Um, it's a magnificent little bird. And it decided that there were Chicago beaches that it thought would be great breeding spots. And they first settled down to breed, I don't know, 7, 8, 10 years ago. I forget when the first one showed up. And there were a lot of people, including people in my own orbit, that said we don't want, we should discourage them from trying to nest there because that's like hordes of volleyball players and it's dogs running all over the place, and these things don't stand a chance. Why encourage them? They're going to nest and they're just going to lose their young. My thought was, let's put our trust in people. This is the Chicago area with a strong environmental community, and you all didn't disappoint. You know, maybe not you personally, but the environmental community, you know, the Chicago Ornithological Society and other groups took these under their wing. And fortunately, the Chicago Park District was amenable to that, and they fenced off a piece. And these things have been nesting there ever since, and now their progeny are nesting there, and also up at Waukegan Beach now too. So we have made room. We've made room in the third largest metropolitan area in the country. We've made room for these little birds in the places that are treasured by people for our own use, right? Well, this was really symbolic for me that we would do that. So anyway, good news there. So we have to ask ourselves, though, going forward, for urban residents, our outdoor experience is going to be among the experiences urban residents have. That's the importance of building nature into urban areas. Only if we help create and cultivate those opportunities. They no longer happen as an automatic byproduct of childhood like they did with me and so many others. Protecting and restoring nature and the opportunity to experience it in the places where people live will be of increasing importance if we hope to develop a citizenry that broadly shares values of a natural world. In nature-filled cities, maybe the preservation of the wild. Now think about that. I think this could be the most significant of the urban conservation challenges in terms of future consequences, getting people in urban areas exposed to nature. So I could have listed a whole bunch of examples of how we're doing that, including from organizations I'm part of now, like the Conservation Foundation and Nature Conservancy. But I picked this one, the Space to Grow, because I was most familiar with it. like many other programs of other organizations, it's part of a national movement of creating green schoolyards to expose kids to nature. Here it's sponsored by the Healthy Schools Campaign and Open Lands. Those are the two primary entities. And of course, all the schools. It turns schoolyards away from asphalt and into functional spaces, still to play, but also to learn, to garden, and to be outside. And it's a great extension of the classroom for lessons ranging from science experiments to nutrition education. And now we have 36 schoolyards serving 36,000 Chicago students. So good news. Oh, wrong button. Let me do this. I'm going to talk just briefly about this American Wildlife Values Report, because this speaks to the changes happening in an urban population. It grouped people into four categories. I'm just going to focus on these two. Traditionalists, um, uh, traditionalists who believe animals should be used for purposes that benefit humans, like hunting, like fishing, things like that, trapping. Mutualists, on the other hand, believe that animals deserve the same rights as humans and treat them more like family than as something outside their family group. They view animals as companions and part of their social networks. They project human traits onto animals, for better or worse. But the key thing here is that the decline in traditionalists, meaning like the hunting and fishing community, has been profound in some states, and it's happening at a very rapid pace. Traditionalists are declining, mutualists increasing. Interest in hunting and fishing is declining. This is a manifestation, I think, of the move toward the urbanization of America. Interest in wildlife viewing is increasing. And here's something that's pretty significant, and you got to think about it for a second. Results from this research show that 50% of Hispanic residents and 43% of Asians identify as mutualists. So this 35% is the average of everybody, but Hispanics and Asians identify as mutualists, 43% of them, 50%, compared to 32% of whites. And both groups have only half as many traditionalists as they used to have. And the US Census Bureau projects that by 2045, current minority populations will outnumber white non-Hispanic populations. And that reality has brought the need for workforce diversity to the forefront in fish and wildlife agencies and in conservation organizations everywhere. One of the things we've had to do because of all the challenges we're facing is take a broader scope, broader approach away from site by site conservation to a landscape approach for a variety of reasons. Challenges cross political boundaries. Single conservation entities can't do it alone anymore. You got to link with others. You need to think, plan, design, and act across broad landscapes because that's the scale of our challenges, and you need to be adaptive. And so we created these things about 10 years ago called 15 years ago, landscape conservation cooperatives. They don't exist as that name anymore. That went away with the change of the administrations years ago already. But the partnerships stayed, and we would organize people around these big geographies, all the environmental organizations and agencies. We organized them all. I was part of the blue one, number 16. That was the Great Lakes, Upper Midwest and Great Lakes, LCC. And the one below it was the Eastern Tallgrass Prairie, LCC. And when LCCs went away, those partnerships that still existed combined now to form something that's called the Midwest Landscape Initiative. They have their own webpage if you want to go on there sometime and take a look at it. So here's an example project that we did at a landscape scale, just to get a sense of how we functioned. One of the big challenges in aquatic conservation is maintaining connectivity. We've interrupted streams with all kinds of barriers to fish migrations, dams and culverts and things like that. In the upper right, you see that lake sturgeon wishing it could get past that hydropower dam, but it's just not going to make it. And you see some of those culverts that are perched above the water level, and they're not going to do any good for maintaining connectivity. So there are these barriers. How do you deal with them? There's a lot of them. How many? 275,902 across the Great Lakes Basin. The blues are all the road crossings, the dams are the red. And there are red all through there, but they're totally sort of washed out by the blues. So first of all, knowing how many you have, so that's a lot. If you want to start fixing them, where do you start? Well, you got to kind of think through which are the worst actors. So we assigned each barrier a passability rating. And then there was a project called Fishworks that the University of Wisconsin developed to optimize barrier removals for economic efficiency and habitat benefits. So now we know which are the ones that give the best bang for the buck, and that's where we would start. So the LCCs did projects like this that helped inform what the natural resource managers would do by providing tools for them to do that work. Illinois, these dam removals weren't part of that effort, but I just wanted y'all to be aware of what we've been doing in Illinois in terms of dam removals. Governor Quinn started this dam removal initiative, and I remember that because I was at the DNR at that time, in 2009. And since 2010, we've removed 30 dams statewide. 3 were removed on the Chicago River, a dozen on the Des Plaines. Recently, the Carpentersville Dam was removed. A little bit before that, South Batavia Dam. And here's a shout out to the Conservation Foundation. The Growey Mill Dam removed on Salt Creek in 2023. And we're seeing big changes in the fish population already because of it. So that's all good news. I'm going to talk about some of the bigger impact things and start to look toward the future now. I'm going to wind up here soon. We had new funding for state grants. It's never been enough. We've always had plenty of money for the sort of the traditional hunting and fishing end of it, but never enough for the non-game wildlife, as we like to call it. So the State Wildlife Grant Program came along in 2000 and started to provide federal grant funding for the species of greatest conservation need. These are not necessarily species in the emergency room. They're kind of in the waiting room outside, though. And if we don't do something to address them now, we need to, we're going to be in trouble later on because we're going to have to list these things. So we created state wildlife action plans, and we get dollars from the federal government as a result. Not enough, but at least it's a start. And there's an effort to try and increase those. So here's Illinois' Wildlife Action Plan. And one aspect of the plan was these conservation opportunity areas where the DNR figured these are the best places where we want to focus our resources. But the Wildlife Action Plan itself was developed in cooperation with many, many partners. So the idea here was these are shared conservation opportunity areas, and we're encouraging partners to invest their resources in these places across the Illinois landscape. Another statewide initiative that took place much earlier that you're probably familiar with is the Illinois Natural Areas Inventory. This was a groundbreaking study when it was done in the late 70s. And it surveyed all of the areas that still had significant natural areas values. And up to the present, we've got about 1,500 INAI sites. 620 of them have all or portions that are protected by Illinois nature preserves, and that's about a quarter of all the INAI acres. So the idea with these INA sites is ideally you get them all under formal protection because these are the remaining reservoirs of biodiversity in Illinois. And if we lose these, we're going to be losing genetic material forever. So they're a relatively small area compared to the entire state, but they're doing their job. They're serving as the last refuge. And so we then developed a strategy for how to sustain those. And this was a study done by Deanna Glosser quite a few years ago now. And it took all those natural areas and it created a paradigm for how we approach them. So we want to protect the natural areas themselves, but you want to increase the size around them so there's buffer, because a lot of these are amazingly small, a matter of 10, 20, 30 acres. Some are bigger, but a lot of them are very, very small. And you need to buffer these so that they can be sustained indefinitely. So protecting the site itself, building buffer areas around them to expand the size, and then connecting them to other habitats is the way that this document fleshed out as the best way to approach these areas. And then from a truly amazing vision, half Earth, this is what they call a BHAG, a big, hairy, audacious goal. And this is by none other than E.O. Wilson, the late great ecologist. So he said, this is bold thinking, but it's not wishful thinking, and it's not hyperbolic, because he was an amazing scientist, and he had done a lot of work on developing theories of island biogeography that linked size of an area to number of species that it could have and hold over time without losing the biodiversity. And so he concluded we needed to protect no less than half the planet. And it's laid out in Half Earth. It's a short little book. I encourage you all to take a look at it. But his work based on island biogeography shows that smaller habitats will support and hold fewer species. And the relevant prediction here is that if we protect half of Earth's habitats, we'll retain 80% of its life forms. You'd like to protect it all, but half Earth would protect 80%. And at this stage of the human population, size and distribution, that's probably a goal we can be happy with, quite honestly. So in 2019, this was 4 years after he published this book, and I think 3 years after his death, scientists across the world first formalized this half-Earth goal, and they called it the Global Deal for Nature. So this was an important next step where all the world scientists came together. And it was intended to stem biodiversity loss, but it had a secondary goal too, as a climate change mitigation strategy, because these natural areas pull carbon dioxide out of the air, build it into their tissues, and put it into the soil. So it sequesters carbon. And many scientists would say there's no pathway to tackling climate change without efforts to protect and restore nature. The two have to go hand in hand. So we have no choice but to take on this challenge or continue down the path of the sixth great extinction. So how do you measure progress toward 50%? Well, you start with a more modest goal. This is still huge, but this is protecting 30% of the world's ecosystems by 2030. Again, to develop this dual issue. And we've made some progress on it. Australia's commitment to 30 by 30, they've got a national roadmap. They're confident they're going to get there. Eternal Mongolia, a plan to protect 30% of Mongolia. This is all from publications from this summer. Canada is set to protect 30% of its land and water by 2030. They're on track. So good news from some of these. I can't tell you how all the nations of the world are doing on it. I can tell you what we did under President Biden. We did not sign on to the global initiative as a country. There were two entities that didn't sign on. One was the Vatican. The other one was the United States of America. Because we would have needed Senate ratification, and there was no way you would have gotten that through the Senate. So the way the presidents do this now to get something done is executive orders. And this was Biden's executive order on 30 by 30. So what did we do in Illinois beyond that? And this is an amazing story. That guy is Paul Ritter. He's a teacher who I wish I could have had as my biology teacher when I was in high school. He's at Pontiac Township High School. He challenged his students to figure out how we're going to address 30 by 30 in Illinois. And they worked with legislators, and they got state legislation passed that directed the DNR to study this and to hold 3 listening sessions around the state, which we did. And I was fortunate enough to chair that exercise. And so I was right in the middle of it, and it was an amazing thing. We created this 30 by 30 conservation task force. And we did these listening sessions, and those students were on those listening sessions. We produced a report. You can find this online. I think it's on the DNR website. And here's one of the outcomes to get to 30%. So right now we're at 4.2% protected. Got a long ways to go. We would need to add an area that, I better move quickly. I'm going to move real quick now. We need to add an area the size of New Jersey to get there. And we've added only 27,000 acres in the last 5 years. So getting to, 30%. And really in a state like Illinois, that's 75% ag, you're not going to get there anyway. So we have to look at other sustainable use targets. And those sustainable use targets, let me back up, are, in my mind, conservation agriculture. You go for the acreage, it's in the biggest land use. Why do you rob banks? Because that's where the money is. Why do you work on ag? Because that's where the acres are, right? And so you work on conservation agriculture as an adjunct to what you do in protecting those INAI sites with buffers and connections. You work on sustainable ag. And that notion of silphium tickling the bellies of the buffalo, this is Nechusa grasslands. And it is in my mind, the model for how we go about doing conservation in Illinois going forward. Now, can you see the arrow, my arrow here? There's a purple coneflower tickling the belly of that buffalo. It's not a silphium, but it's the next best thing, right? Nechusa grasslands is at almost 5,000 acres. There it is, near the Rock River by Grand Detour. They're halfway there. They're at about 4,500 acres, and they bought land that had a whole bunch of knobs that were Illinois Natural Area Inventory sites. They built prairie buffer around it. They used volunteers to do it. They're doing educational work there, and their goal is to connect it all up with the Rock River and with the Franklin Creek State Natural Area. And to me, that's the model for how we go forward. In the meantime, I want to take it back to you all because native landscaping is important. And you all know that, but in my mind, it empowers everyone to contribute to the twin crises of biodiversity loss and climate change. And I hope I've reinforced in all of you a sense of the urgency to do all of that. We can all help push back against biodiversity loss and climate change. If you've never done so, you should take a look at the map compiled by the Chicago Living Corridors Alliance. I don't know if that group is even active anymore, but they compiled all the registered native natural landscaping efforts that people have done under different organizations like the Conservation Foundation and Citizens for Conservation and on and on. And they've got a map on their website. And I first looked at it and I saw my little patch, my yard on it. And when I saw the gabillion other spots all over the Chicago area, I came to appreciate Doug Tallamy's assessment that what we are doing through native landscaping collectively is building habitat the size of a national park. This is important stuff we're all doing. And it's in these grassroots actions that I see a most exciting future for conservation. In addition to what people are doing on our public lands, it's what they're doing in their own backyards and on church and school grounds and on corporate campuses. That's so inspiring. It's a rebellion against our default urban landscape of largely unnecessary bluegrass sod. People are building nature into the places they inhabit, one backyard at a time. Each yard becomes a mini conservation hub. It connects across backyards to forest preserves and utility and highway rights-of-ways. We don't think about conservation anymore solely in terms of the formerly protected land base. We can all contribute from the smallest planter box to the largest golf course or the corporate campus. This is a powerful concept.